Hello and welcome to the Beginner Drawing Course Week 8 Assignment Demo. This demo is here to help you get the most out of the assignment of the first edition of the Beginner Drawing Course, which went up to Week 8. As of this recording, there are 16 weeks, so be sure to check those out as well if you haven't already. The additional weeks are available in the 16-week edition, or on the Gumroad page you can get the additional lessons that you missed. So that would be the additional 4 weeks, so up to 12, or the additional 8 weeks up to 16. At any rate, we are going to talk quickly through this assignment and then show you a time-lapse demo creating the final here, which we will just sort of go through and talk about all the basics that we've learned throughout the course and how they help us to reach this result. So basically, it's to plan and draw a character or illustration from your imagination, applying all of the following tools, tactics, and techniques. So all the lines we walked through, all of the shapes, so weeks 1 and 2, the week 4, I believe, is the week where we talk about values. There's having an established light source. We talked about that in the values lesson. Finally, we are emphasizing deliberate design decisions and mark making, which we talk way more about even in later lessons of the BDC here. It's also helpful to flip and rotate the canvas, squint, take breaks, stop and study, so find some reference and work from it if you get stuck, and then draw and redraw everything as many times as it takes to get correct. So you better come correct in this final assignment here. But in all sincerity, I'm excited to show you the time lapse, and we're going to get into that right now. Okay, so here we are starting with what I dubbed RPG class concepts. I find sometimes it's a little intimidating just to start doodling and then figure out what you're going to do from there. You got to have some sort of vague direction, some sort of limiter to help you kind of zone in on what you're going to be creating. So in this case, I just went with something that I'm pretty comfortable with, and that is RPG class concepts, role-playing game. So that helps me sketch out these 2 quick figures in very rough format. You've seen me do some very rough sketching in this sort of gestural way. It is really, really helpful. I actually think week 5 was values now that I'm thinking about it. Week 4 was gestures. So the gestural element really helps us here. It helps us to use all the different line types to get an idea of what we're going to be creating from imagination. It helps to give some sketchy form to those ideas at first so that we can return to them later with more certainty. We already had some demonstration of this in the actual lesson file of the Beginner Drawing Course Week 8, but here we're going to be focusing even more so on it. So you see I'm using a lot of very loose lines. These are a mixture of diagonals for dynamism and action. There are some curved lines to help with the flow of things. We have some more vertical lines in terms of our constructive elements, horizontal lines included. And we also have some lost and found lines, even at this very gestural point. I'm also just throwing some names around just to help me get a clearer idea of how the designs are going to play out. If you want to know more about design, you can check out the character drawing course where we cover a pretty solid amount of design principles when it comes to characters. But we are going to go even more into that as I roll out more lessons for the Character Design for Beginners course. That course, as of this recording, is not yet released, but please keep an eye out because I am excited to help you create characters and design them well. So in the next step, we're just sitting here, rotating the canvas, as I mentioned, and going through the process of redrawing our character with more certainty and solidity. So that means that we're going to take into account the structures, the shapes that we laid in our sketch phase, and we're going to make those shapes way clearer, way more readable, way more understandable. So at this phase, I'm just drawing this dude, flipping the canvas a ton to double check what I'm doing with the eyes, because you really don't want to goof up too much on the face. I've talked about this numerous times throughout the course. I will belabor this point into the ground and into the earth so that it can sink in to your brain. I just can't say it enough. I let a lot of jank faces fly in the beginning of my art journey, and I I just I don't have any room for it anymore, and I don't want you to either. So after we get our face looking reasonable, we then start going downward in terms of the body, in terms of drawing the rest of the body. You can see I'm using a myriad of different types of lines. Sometimes I am sketching them very straight. Sometimes there's a little bit of curve to them. Other times, you can see there's some detail inference, like through those fuzzier lines. And to be honest, I feel I did overwork this piece. It was very late at night when I was recording this demo, and some of this drawing that I'm seeing here, I like better than the final, which, it happens. Don't be too hard on yourself. As long as you're applying the principles, trying to get better, sometimes knowing in your process how not to goof up things is also something that we'll talk about. That's actually a little more intermediate. So this is still focusing on foundational principles for the beginner. And that is what I'm trying to essentially do here, is just use these lines to help you understand the various shapes, to draw through the unseen side. So the cylinder of the forearm, for example, I'm erasing and redrawing the bicep as I sort of outlined in the assignment, because I know that it takes, sometimes several iterations to get a reasonable looking shape, something that has solidity and form and feels like it has some dimension. So I'm flipping pretty compulsively here, which sometimes I end up doing just because it's a pretty natural part of the process for me. But sometimes I just have too much coffee as well, and that can, add an element of freneticism to the drawing, which may or may not be desirable depending on what you're going for. So just control your caffeine intake a little bit. Just a little side pro tip here for the course. One thing you also want to consider is what type of material you're drawing. This is a bit intermediate, but I figure I will touch on it here just because it bears a lot of relevance. So what I'm doing is configuring the more cloth-like elements in this design. It's almost like an extended kilt in various pieces. I'm thinking barbarian. He's sort of a druid barbarian mixture. So druid allowing him to kind of transform his body with various animal or biological nature magics, and then the barbarian part helping him to have that sort of robust and intimidating figure. And also some of the design decisions were made based on the barbarian archetype. So you'll see a lot of that rough leather sort of strips and shapes that kind of fall across a barbaric figure. And it's just really helpful to keep some of that in mind. So I'm doing that with some of the shapes and some of the other ways that I'm designing. I thought of like, okay, well, if he's sort of druidic, barbaric, he's got maybe a turtle shell pauldron, one of the spikier turtles, like a snapping turtle, and maybe its bones make for reasonable armor when it comes to, dealing with sharper weaponry that foes may have. I think that blunt weapons will probably shatter it, but depends on the type of magical turtle, I suppose. These are things that you can just sort of think of in terms of your lore, in terms of whatever you're building out. But for the purpose of drawing, we're really just taking our time designing these shapes. And it's easier to lay these shapes in once we have an established drawing. So the torso is basically one big square. The arms are cylinders that I have modified to look like muscles. You also have cylinders for legs that are sort of, a hybrid between a cube and a cylinder, because some of these shapes are very, very stark and staunch, and I'm using very constructive lines to help establish them. And then I've basically at this point worked my way down to the feet, and we're going to be kind of wrapping up the demo here kind of soon. I've done pretty much all the things I've talked about, save for really rotating the canvas a bunch. I was squinting during the creation of this image, so just kind of taking my ideas and seeing if the shapes are working by squinting at them. One thing I'm doing here as well is getting rid of large pieces and redrawing them if the shapes are not aligning the way that I would like. So I have this huge diagonal element going across his body in the form of the belt for the pauldron. I have redrawn the kilt, sort of barbarian kilt, a couple times now, just because I wanted a reasonable amount of flow, a reasonable amount of believability, and I don't want it to flatten the forms. It flattens the forms if I have a shape that's either too complex or doesn't follow the dimensionality I'm trying to create with the shapes, which means that the lines that I'm using, they would look like they're clipping through the figure or making it look odd in some way. And that's something that you'll see when you're squinting. I'm working really assiduously to make sure that it's a fairly quick sketch. It only took about an hour, but I'm working pretty assiduously to make sure that the elements on this figure kind of line up properly and don't create parts where things are flattening out or tangenting out, which is something we'll talk more about in week 9 of the beginner drawing course. But it just helps to have that in the demonstration here. You see I'm redrawing the lines several times, redrawing certain elements several times, even after laying them in, just because it is one way of iterating, one way of making sure that things are getting a little bit better or a little bit more believable in terms of the drawing. I'm rounding out some of the shadow areas with little occlusions, little weighted lines that turn into small triangular elements that we talked about in some of the other assignment demos, because it helps to pop forms. And that's what you see me doing here, is just adding little details now that all the big shapes are established. We usually work, head to toe, and then we start to add little occlusions, little areas that pop things out after all our other lines and shapes are looking good. And then we begin to start going into the medium and small shapes, which of course means detail work. And all of this is from imagination. I was just, redrawing and trying to find things that worked, trying to find areas where the eye could rest, areas where the eye could kind of get stuck on, like the tortoise shell or the face, of course. So this is time to start playing with a little bit of values here. What you'll see me do is run the contour of the character and just do a flat fill. Sometimes I will use the polygonal lasso as opposed to the freeform lasso. But once you have the character all lassoed out, you just add a color that you like underneath, and then you can see the silhouette a lot better, you can see the design a lot better, and then you can go in and fill some of those areas that kind of were imperfectly paint bucketed there, and that it sort of helps to establish more form. One thing I wanted to do before the demo was over was add some sort of light source to help pop the character off even more, which means that we're going to be using some values to differentiate different elements. The color I chose was sort of like Sculpey, if you've ever worked with that, which is a medium for clay, or it's a clay medium that allows you to sculpt. They have a simulation of it in ZBrush if you've ever used that software, and I find it helps to see form a little bit better. So I start with that higher key base value, and then we start working our way down into these shadow shapes. We're always thinking in shapes because it allows us to create from our imagination in a simplified format. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm thinking of the shadows as shapes. What surface planes, like the Asaro head, are falling back, which ones are going to be illuminated, which it helps to have that little light insignia there. Again, I'm just sort of simulating a 3D software in my head and on my canvas. And that's sort of what I want you to start thinking about and doing. It helps if you've had some 3D experience, but even if you haven't, these are just helpful little ways of parsing and managing what you're doing on the picture plane. So now we have a couple values here and there. And again, I like the Sculpey more than I like the purple for the final, but that's, one of the things you can configure as you watch your own work back. But this is sort of where we add just a couple little highlights, just push the forms just a tad, and that's pretty much it for the demo. I want to thank you for watching, thank you for taking the course, and I will see you in the future lessons. Happy creating.